I have kept a secret longer than most people keep a marriage, longer than some keep a job. It sits with me now like a weight I learned to carry across 4 decades, heavy, steady, and finally lightened only by the telling of it. The truth is simple to state and impossible to say without the small, mundane facts that made it true. The lanterns that failed in a midsummer storm, the smell of wet pine in the barn, the way a radio playing classical music could hush a roomful of wildness. I will give those facts in order. I will give the dates. I owe that much to him. August 1984. I was 42 that year, still calling myself a handyman, though most of my work had drifted towards small renovations and the occasional repair at the lodge outside Sisters. I had a little weathered house on a ridge of private timber, 20 acres that had been my father's, then mine, then enough of a refuge that I stopped taking jobs that required me to sleep at other people's houses. I slept with a window open to the sound of the firs. I kept a lantern on the kitchen table. I kept my hands busy. The first time I saw him, I thought, for an absurd second, that someone had left a man asleep in the shade of the barn. He was enormous and folded like a child's stuffed horse, thick-limbed, a face half hidden by hair, and when he moved, there was a carefulness to it that did not belong to anything I had ever seen in a hunting camera or the odd stray cow. It was late afternoon. The light leaned long and warm against the hay. The dog, Clem, had started barking in a way that woke me up out of a book. I went to see and found him. He did not leap or roar. He did not run. He lay, alert and breathing, and when he met my eyes, the first thing I noticed was his hands. They were big. They were worn in a pattern that looked a lot like work and a lot like gentleness. He looked like someone who had used hands to make things, and someone who had used hands to hold things broken. I did the only sensible thing I could think of. I went back and fetched water. Later, when the animal healer from Bend, Dr. Lisa Chen, would ask me about his eyes, I would tell her they were curious more than terrified. There was intelligence there that made a man do practical, stupid things. I had never wanted to be an outlaw, but there on my barn floor, I became one by degrees. The story of how he came to my property is not an epic of tracking or of mythic pursuit. It began with a trap. Someone, or something, had found its leg in a rusted foothold and had tried to free itself. The metal had not let go. I found the site the morning after he came to the barn, a smear of grass and broken undergrowth where a fight had happened. The trap itself was old. It had a history. For months afterward, I would think about the person who set it. I would think about the person who left it. He needed care. That was the simplest statement of the obligation I felt then, and it was the first moral decision that set the shape of 20-odd years.
He could not be taken to a clinic. He could not be put on a truck. The hamlets around us had people who loved stories and who loved a reward. I made a bed of straw in the back of the barn, and I learned stitches from a VHS tape at the library, because even then a plumber or a lodge worker would know the difference between a human emergency and an animal's need. He ate things I could not name at first, roots boiled in water, a deer flank when I could haul one down in the night. He would not take food from me without first touching my hand to the offering, a small ritual that became ours. We made a system. I drew cards and pictures and taught him to point. It sounds beneath explanation, and at the same time it was the only thing that made sense. I had moved to the ridge to escape neighbors. I never expected to take on the task of teaching an intelligence a human language of things. But we used picture cards, simple laminated squares with a heart, with fire, with food, with sleep. He learned that a heart meant kindness, that the radio meant music, meant the room was safe. He learned to nod when he wanted to be left alone, to tap twice when he wanted to watch the trees. He learned a name. I called him Samuel because David had a hard time with names, and because Samuel seemed to fit the slow, kind gravity in that face. Names are a human convenience. In truth, he answered to the rhythm of the barn and to the sound of my voice when I sang low. He learned to make me laugh with a crooked smile that showed he understood more than I could ever document. The first year was all bandages and quiet. I was clumsy in some things and slight in others. I learned how to bring in bottled water without leaving a trail. I learned to rope game trails away from my human paths so that Samuel could move without being seen. I learned how to talk in a whisper that did not startle the larger world. We built a tunnel that first winter to connect the back of the barn to the little hollow in the pines where the ground was softer. Just a crawl space lined with rough sawed wood that would let him slip out after dusk and return before dawn. The tunnel became a promise, a way in and out that meant safety without spectacle. There were times in those early months when I believed, in my practical, lonely way, that I could bear anything for the sake of his recovery. There were times I cried over a boiled root like a man who had held too many funerals for imagined things. People who read memoirs expect a great cruelty or a great kindness to be the origin of secrets. In our case, it was neither. It was an accumulation of small votes, small acts that added up to obligation. I did not tell anyone. The word secret is too dramatic for the way it felt, more a silence than a theft. I thought then that silence could be sanctity. I thought my father had taught me that dignity was private. That belief lasted until the night in March of 1994 when Samuel saved me back.
I had been clearing a fallen oak that afternoon, something men with my hands always do, dragging wood, cursing the knots, thinking of little else. My chest had hurt for a while. I had chalked it up to work, to stress, to getting older. The clinic and sisters had told me to rest, but rest is a rare commodity when bills are due and the roof begins to leak. I remember the sky that day, flat and low, and the way the air smelled like rain and iron. I remember the suddenness, a pressure in my ribs, a cave that opened behind my sternum, and then blackness swallowing the edge of the world. I woke on a pallet of straw in the barn. There was a wet cloth under my neck, and a steady, careful hand on my shoulder, that, in all the years afterward, I could place down to the pain receptors of my memory. Samuel was there, enormous as ever, bent with a care that looked like a person holding an old man's head. The radio, my poor scratchy radio, was playing a slow movement of a quartet. His breath smelled of cedar and the marrow of things he had eaten. He had, apparently, dragged me into the barn when I collapsed on the trail between the woodshed and the drive. When I blinked awake, my first clear thought was that I had been rescued, and then that my rescuer was so large it made the kitchen look small. You did this," I said, throat rasping, because the English words were the only ones that came to me as I returned from the place where silence had taken me. He looked at me and lifted a hand, a careful, hesitant motion, and touched my shoulder, the same way he had learned to touch the cards. He tapped twice on the picture of a heart I had left on the table, and then, with an awkwardness that has never left me, he tried to mimic the old-fashioned human ritual of a squeeze. His fingers wrapped around my hand like a vice, and then like a glove. There was a human steadiness there, and an apology for being clumsy. He had not known how to ask for permission to move me. He had only known how to act. I learned later, from the scratch of my own journal and a phone call I made to the clinic 3 days after, where I listened to my own heartbeat described as concerning, and then scheduled a test, that I had suffered a myocardial infarction. The doctors called it a heart attack. I called it a reminder. The truth is that I might have died on the trail if he had not found me. He might have simply stood there and made sounds. He might have carried the timbers of me to the back of the barn and left me to drift. Instead, he had become, in a space of minutes, my savior. There is a debt in such moments that is not accounted in money or law. If a man saves another from death, one expects, in simple reciprocity, some obligation. I had thought my obligation would be simple. I would feed him, I would keep him hidden, and I would repay him by a life lived in care.
Instead, the debt took on shapes I could not have foreseen. After that night, our arrangements solidified into ritual. I went to the clinic and told only Dr. Lisa the truth of the injury, more by way of necessity than confession. She looked at my chart, the telltale scar beginning at the sternum, and then at me, and did not ask the kinds of questions a curiosity would propose. She asked instead about medication and diet. When I did tell her, finally, about the creature in the barn, she did not laugh so much as breathe, as if into a pillow. She had worked in remote clinics. She had seen things that did not fit well into protocol. She promised discretion. She also gave me an inhaler and a list of do's and don'ts. She called me later to say someone had been asking about old traps in the area. An elk hunter, she said, had reported a strange animal on a game trail. I learned then to read silence as signal. In the months that followed, I kept my promise. I patched my heart with medications and with a small secret dignity. Samuel watched the days fold into the months with a patience that resembled age. He learned to differentiate between my aches and my jokes. He would sit by the doorway and place his hand on the threshold when I left for a day, a gesture that I came to understand as a benediction. The whole community of my life became small and careful. I learned, over dinners and late nights, how to bring in deer meat without leaving evidence of boot tracks. I learned to walk paths that avoided the park ranger's usual beats. In the early 90s, there was less technology to fear. There was no ubiquitous satellite mapping that a careless neighbor might consult. We had only our small habits and the kindness of a few people. There is a cost to secrecy that cannot be measured by legal drifts. I began to trade company for safety. I stopped dating in any serious way. The barn became a world unto itself. The radio, a simple wood stove that emptied smoke into the chimney and not into the yard. A calendar where the months were marked by the growth rings on a felled oak I kept in the workshop. I taught Samuel the small comforts: music before sleep, boiled roots when the weather turned, which side of the blanket was warmer. He taught me other things that did not have names: how to listen for small changes in the wind, how the forest carried the scent of a stranger, how to be present without being intrusive. He saved me again in the spring of 2015, when the chest pains returned with a violence that made the world a gray smear. That time he did not wait for louder instruments. He slammed a stump against the back door, until David, my nephew and then a park ranger, came by with a truck and a blanket. I can still see David's face that night, lit by the pickup's dome light, the combination of professional calm and the private horror of learning in one short instant that the stories he half believed as a child were true. David became the succession I had not prepared for. He came to the barn once, then twice, then with Emily, his wife, a careful biologist whose fingers remembered the names of plants. They moved into a spare trailer behind my property for a season and then bought the 40 acres adjacent to mine in the late 90s when the developer briefly sniffed around town. Their arrival was a kind of relief. I had dreaded what my passing might mean for Samuel. Who would carry the knowledge? Who would keep the ritual of the heart card? When I handed David the first of the laminated cards, its corner already softened by Samuel's thumb, he did not flinch. He put it in his wallet like a promise. We kept our circle tight. Dr. Lisa came sometimes with sutures and with a quiet informality that I came to expect. She taught Samuel how to sit during an examination and made a face as if petting an old dog when he let her. Emily ran tests in a way that made the tent of secrecy feel almost scholarly. She archived notes in a way that would have made a university dean proud, but locked the files away in a safe. We were conspirators in a moral project that had little to do with law and everything to do with answerable, to him, to the life in front of us. The years were a soft accumulation. There were afternoons of hay and nights of rain that passed like beads on a string. Samuel learned to make coffee the way I liked it, 1 cup, not strong, by dragging a pot to the stove and turning a knob with a hand that was careful because it mattered. He loved radio dramas and an old set of Rachmaninoff records I found of a thrift store. He would tilt his head during a certain strain in the music and let the barn vibrate with that human sense of recognition. And yet, the world nudged at our shelter. In 2003, a logging company inched with polite papers toward our ridge. In 2007, a neighbor's hunting party set off a chain that made census taut. In 2008, a regional influenza made even our small circle fearful for his lungs. There were near misses. A contractor who came without notice and smelled like gasoline and new plywood, a drone that hovered over a ridge and startled the hens, a Google Earth image taken from a passing satellite and then, years later, pointed out by an armchair naturalist on a forum who wondered why one property had strange shadows near the barn. We responded in ways a slow government never could. Emily bought land. David altered fence lines. We built another layer to the tunnel, a false entrance and a return that meant no single pathway could betray where the barn led. We created a ledger of food sources, rabbits through legal hunts, a deer shared quietly by a man who owed me a favor, a salmon once offered by an old fisherman from Bend who said nothing and left a cooler on my back porch. We taught Samuel to understand the small deceptions of privacy without ever making him complicit in lies in a way that broke him. He did not like being deceived. He accepted it as a human necessity. I have said nothing here about the nights I lay awake and worried. Those are the confessions no man enjoys. The thought that I might die and his secret would go with me, that my illness might reveal him as a consequence. There were auctions, probate, children who might unearth things. I thought often of my father and his hands, the same hands patterning in mine, and of the idea that promises made to another being could outlast a man. It is true that Samuel returned favors. The night in '94 was not his only saving. He had a crude sense of what it meant to be part of a household, and that included the obligation to protect. In small ways he repaid me, by dragging my truck free of mud when the rains were bad, by somehow cautioning me away from a trail with bear scat when the season was wrong. In larger ways he thrust himself into the act of care, as if we were both members of the same fragile species of obligation. And then came the evening that changed the ledger. December 3, 2021. The snow had not melted entirely from the pines. I had not thought that year would be different from any other. Winter has the same weight every year for small farms. Samuel had been quieter lately, slower in his steps, longer to rise from his straw. We had all noticed but had not yet named it. That afternoon he had gone further into the hollow than usual, and returned with a limp I had not seen before. He ate with less appetite, and slept with his head turned toward the door, as if listening for an absent call. By the time the sky dimmed, the colors of the barn lost their warmth, and the radio hummed a line in a way that made the room feel hollow. I sat beside him and placed my hand on his knuckle. We had, across the years, acquired a vocabulary of touch. A tap on a card, a squeeze for agreement, a long-held palm for sorrow. That night I could not read the cards. He did not lift his hand. He came awake in a way that surprised me. He looked at me, and with emotion that was almost human, he tried to speak. Not words, not English, but a sequence of murmurs that meant to me, if I allowed myself to translate, that something was coming for him. His breathing grew thin, his fingers trembled. I called Dr. Lisa with hands that did not stop shaking long enough to pronounce the problem. She came, as she had done for years, with a case at her hip and a face that had become family to both of us. We did what we could in that room and in those hours. We warmed him, we fed him broth. Dr. Lisa gave meds that made me feel like a criminal pharmacist. She explained doses to me in a low voice. I held his hand and felt a slowness that had nothing to do with sleep. At 2 a.m, when rain had turned again to sleet against the barn roof, he opened his eyes and looked at me. "Promise?" he tried to make himself say, tapping once, slow, as if he were spelling it out with pain.
I had learned the gestures enough to understand that he meant the promise I had never acknowledged out loud, that whatever came, I would not let him suffer as a curiosity, that he would be granted the dignity we had cobbled for him. I promised. I promised like a man pledging his last tobacco, his last coin. I promised that, should the time come and the world press too hard, we would not let him be made into a spectacle. He slept after that. I sat in the chair with my cap in my hands and listened to the radio as if it were some secular prayer. I did not know then that my promise would be interpreted by other people, agents, scientists, a furious public, as an invitation or an insult. I did not know that by promising privacy, I had signed my name in a ledger where the columns would not balance. On the morning of December 4th, he was gone, in a way that was both sudden and not. His breathing stilled. His eyes closed like curtains. They did not open again. We had kept him comfortable, warm, and out of the public eye until the moment his body simply said that it could no longer continue. There was no hero's departure, no last roar into the night. There was the ending of breath and the closing of a heavy, patient eyelid. I suppose the title to this little life could be A Quiet Death. We wrapped him in a blanket with the heart card tucked into his hand because he had always liked that worn cardboard. We poured a cup of coffee and left it beside him like a small offering. We did what one does in private affection. We counted the hours he had lived with us and tried to place them against the debt he had paid. 2 days later, on December 15th, 2021, I mailed a packet to a journalist I had known in college, a man with a steady hand and a conscience I trusted. I sent photos Emily had reluctantly shot, files that David insisted be copy protected, and a note that said plainly that the truth had weight and that we were ready to let it be known, because, in the end, the secret had aged us more than it had protected him. The packet also included a note we had written as a record, the dates, the care instructions, and the story of the trap. We did not intend to blow apart the world, but we were tired of the quiet that had begun to feel like complicity. The journalist called, and then the world called back. The sequence that followed is one many have seen in other forms. Images leaked, video clips recirculated with speculation, DNA samples debated by labs who wanted to be first. Federal agents called us with a thoroughness that made me realize I had been living with a sandbag over an old dam. Agent Sarah Thornton arrived with a badge and a binder of possibilities. She was efficient and not unkind. She asked questions I did not always want to answer, about the legality of concealment, about whether we had endangered anyone by harboring such a creature. She listened in the way bureaucrats have learned to listen, with attention but with an eye on precedent.
The negotiations that followed were never as simple as a yes or no. There were proposals, protective custody for the remains, archival access for Emily's notes, limited publication of certain images for the sake of transparency. There were other proposals that felt like surgical dissections of dignity, offers of federal stewardship that sounded to me like circuses with better light. In the end, after fires of public argument and petitions and ugly headlines that sought to frame kindness as criminality, we struck a compromise of a kind. Samuel was cremated in September 2023 in a private service that felt like a ritual designed by people who had learned to love in secret. Emily oversaw the archiving of the journals. David and I scattered his ashes in the pines where the frost met the light. We recorded the event with a quiet procedural thoroughness, enough to prove that dignity had been intended and kept, and then locked the footage in a vault that would only be opened under court order. The media buzz faded into the long, slower debates of academic panels and legal suits. People wrote essays about personhood and about the ethics of secrecy. There were angry op-eds and sympathetic interviews. There were think pieces about the necessity of government involvement, and, in the middle of it all, a small group of us who had loved him and missed the way his hand fit in mine. I do not pretend the moral ledger cleared clean that day. The public, for all its curiosity, rarely sits with the private gravity of a life lived with care. There were civil suits, there were threats. There were moments when the memory of a man, myself, leaned toward bitterness at the intrusion. There were also moments of unexpected tenderness when a teenager, in a message to Emily's lab, wrote that knowing Samuel had existed made their childhood feel less trivial, as if a small, extraordinary thing had made room for ordinary people to be brave. This is the story of reciprocal debts. The night he pulled me from the trail in 1994, the years of food and care I returned to him, the promise I made in the cold hours of December, and the choice to make one more ledger entry public when secrecy had begun to feel like an affront to his personhood. He paid me back, in a sense, for my life saved that night. I paid him forward, finally, by making sure his end was not a spectacle. There are practicalities to all this, land trusts and legal agreements, and a long, dull year of phone calls with lawyers. There are also smaller things that do not fit on forms. The worn corner of the heart card, the way the radio still paints the room with a velvet sound, the full, stupid grin I keep when I remember how he learned to make coffee. I moved less in public life after 2021. I sit on my porch now and listen to the wind. I am older. The ridge is a better testament to time than I am.
Sometimes I find myself tapping the table with an absent habit, looking for the two-click answer he would give when he wanted to watch the trees. The world asks questions it cannot answer and is impatient with the idea that some things require neighborly care rather than triumphant revelation. I do not regret the choice to keep him safe. I do not regret the choice to speak at the end. I know now that secrets, even when kept for love, calcify into obligations that must be settled before one dies. There will be people who will insist that I should have done the right thing earlier, turned him over to science, to the government, to the collective curiosity. There will be others who will say I betrayed him by revealing the photographs at all. Both are true in different ways. My measures of rightness have always been crude and domestic. Did we feed him? Did we keep him warm? Did we let him go with dignity? In the ledger where those things are counted, I find, even now, an arithmetic that balances enough for me. There are nights when the barn seems to sigh. There are mornings when the radio plays a movement, and I expect to see his head tilt. I keep the cards in a small cedar box in the workshop. Sometimes I take out the heart card and smooth the bend in it with my thumb. That little rectangle of cardboard has outlived any law or headline. It holds, for me, a history that is not easily legislated. I will tell more of it. The near misses, the tunnel we built, the way David learned to lead with gentleness when hunters came too close, the transcripts I will not publish. And I will tell it in the order the years deserve. For now, this is the shape of the debt and the repayment. He saved me in '94, in a way that bent the rest of my life around him. I kept the secret because I believed secrecy could be protection. He came back for his payment in ways that made me confront what I owed him when his life ran out. We paid each other, in the end, with the only currencies we had, hands and promises and the terrible, imperfect mercy of goodbyes. There are more things to tell. The first thing I will tell is the night on the ridge in 1994, because everything else bends toward that moment. It was late October. The wind had a hard, thin edge, and the maples still held a handful of flame. I had been walking the service road, more out of habit than purpose, thinking of a woman I had not managed to keep, when the fog came down and the world shrank to a cone of breath. I slipped on the grass, hit the bank, and the ankle, which had been troublesome for years, folded in a way that turned warmth into a hot shock of pain. I must have blacked out for a while. What came back was the sound of someone humming a melody I would spend the next 20 years puzzling over. He found me, partially under the cedar boughs, a dark shape with hands like someone who had always worked close to the earth. He set a blanket around me like a small, competent kindness, cupped my head, and when I tried to speak, he put a finger to my lips and made that same humming sound again until I stopped shaking enough to speak. He did not ask my name. He did not ask where I had been. He offered me a flask of tea from a thermos, and when I asked where he had come from, he only shrugged and said, "I live not far." That phrase, so domestic, so absurd, was almost the last ordinary thing I heard for many years. He walked me home. He carried the heavier of my packs and put my shoe back on with a careful, impatient tenderness. Later, sitting by the stove while the house settled into night, he said he had been watching the ridge for a while. I had not yet learned how to ask the questions that mattered. I only knew, at the time, that a stranger had kept me from the cold. I owed him the first entry on that strange ledger, my life. Everything that followed grew from that owed life. There was no grand conspiracy in the beginning, no solemn oath sworn by light of lantern. There were grocery lists and the clumsy domestic negotiations of two people who had stumbled into each other's orbit. What jars were in the pantry, which radio station to keep on, how to patch a leak in the roof. The thing that made the arrangement unusual, what made secrecy necessary, was never announced in a declarative sentence. It became apparent in the way he moved through doors, in the way neighbors pretended not to notice the extra mattress in a shed, and the time he avoided crowded places, and the rapid, careful trail of small explanations he offered when a question came too close. We learned how to hide him the way you learn to keep a lantern in a storm, by soft repetition and small architecture. The tunnel was a homegrown thing. David, who arrived not as a hero, but as a man who liked to carry things and to think with his hands, drew the plans on the back of a shopping list, and then, in the cold hours, set about making it. We dug a narrow crawl space from the back of the workshop into the ground under the lean-to, bored out by shovels and the slow chew of a rented auger. The earth smelled raw and deep. The first night we dug, we ate cold beans and talked about the weather as if that explained everything. It was crude. Planks for a ceiling, cedar for the shelves, a hatch that sat flush with the floor of the loft. The tunnel itself was barely tall enough to sit in. It fit a man curled like a saved animal. We lined it with blankets, a small electric lamp, the kind that throws soft yellow light, and a box of books he liked. Old field guides and novels with no pictures. The lid closed with a sound that never stopped making my heart race when I was a child, the dull, finite click of something being safely sealed away. We practiced our indifference. David taught me how to answer questions with the exact amount of information necessary to be plausible. These were the near misses that made us keep our voices low in public and loud in the private spaces where it was safe to be human. He, Samuel, learned the domestic world by being given it. He learned to make coffee in his own way, which became one of the small joys of the household. He would heat the water until it sighed and then pour it through a filter with an attentive slowness, the steam carrying the smell of something ordinary and miraculous at once. He had a curious appetite for details, the exact names of birds, the counsel of old men about when to prune the apple trees, the way a particular song always made his thumb tap the table twice. He made cards when he could not find the words to say, simple rectangles with clumsy scrawl that contained sentences like, "You keep my hands warm," which I keep folded in the cedar box. We recorded some of our conversations, more for myself than for any scientist. Later, those recordings would be asked for with a kind of clinical hunger that made me resent the laboratories and the hands that wanted to take him apart to see what made him human. In a few of the tapes, he asked, quietly, in the way he had when he pulled me from the trail, if I thought he was living rightly. I remember how the tape picked up the small scrape of a chair as I leaned forward and said something foolish and large. "We are doing what we can." He laughed at that and said, "Then it is good." Those tapes contain more than data. They hold the texture of two imperfect lives stitching themselves together. I have refused to publish them because a person does not exist solely as curiosity. To make him public while he was still his own man, unasked, unanointed by consent, felt like theft. After he died, when the photographs were unearthed and laboratory lights found their way to my porch, Emily and I agreed that some things would be shared and some would not. The tapes are among the withheld things. Their silence respects a privacy that law sometimes forgets exists. Emily's role came later and was, in many ways, the hinge upon which the last decisions turned. She arrived as someone with a quiet hunger for knowledge and the kind of discretion that can exist only in people who have told themselves to be careful for the sake of things that are fragile.
She asked questions that cut to the bone about consent, about dignity, about what it meant to be an object of study. And she listened to my answers with an intelligence that did not seek to own the story. When the end approached, she sat up with him more than once, holding the lamp while I doled out the powder for pain and the warm cloth for the skin cooled by fever. In the last days, she folded into the household not as a scientist first, but as a companion in the quiet execution of care. The decision to reveal anything at all came out of an odd algebra of affection and shame.
For years I had believed that secrecy was the purest form of protection, that by keeping him from the world I would spare him the hunger of others and the dull cruelty of exposure. But secrecy calcifies. In private, a life can become a museum piece no one is allowed to touch. It becomes less a life and more a thing we move around according to our convenience. When his time came, I saw that leaving him as an artifact would be a theft of a different order. He had walked me through the shadow of death and given me not only breath, but a steady hand. I concluded, perhaps selfishly, perhaps rightly, that he deserved more than the silence I had insisted upon for so long. So I made the ledger entry public in the way I could, a measured disclosure, a request for privacy, along with the facts necessary to make the narrative understood. Emily published photographs with careful captions. A report accompanied them that spoke to ethics and to the limits of curiosity. I refused, however, to become a spectacle on television or in the endless churn of pundits. When a documentarian came to the house, hungry for angle and conflict, I told him the truth. No, I told him the only thing worse than a lie. I said that if his film could not be an act of respect, then he would not come in. He left. That kind of small, stubborn decency felt like a final thing we owed him. There were legal scuffles after the revelation, petitions, suits, a demand for the artifacts to be sent to institutions with better facilities than my barn. People argued whether a life like his could be owned by a private citizen, and in courtrooms the language we used to make the world legible became thin and brittle. I furnished lawyers with affidavits and a list of the neighbors who could testify to the way we had tended to him. I endured headlines. I endured, too, the personal question that got lodged in my throat at every handshake. Did I do the right thing? There is no tidy answer. I did the only thing I could imagine living with. In the ledger of my life, that entry, though imperfect, seemed to balance. Not all moments were fateful. Some were slight and ridiculous and therefore exactly human. The way he learned to make coffee, the ridiculous grin he got when he managed to slice an apple without nicking himself, the cadence of his laugh when something surprised him. These are the things I go back to when the nights are long and the barn sighs. I find the heart card and smooth it, and for a moment the weight of larger decisions is tempered by the precise feel of paper under my thumb. There are more acts to tell. The time the tunnel almost failed because of a storm that washed out part of the lean-to. The night a neighbor's flashlight swept across the yard and stopped just short of the workshop. The way David taught me to speak in sentences that hid more than they revealed. I will tell them in the order they deserve, with the pauses they require. It was a defense, yes, but also an exercise in preserving the humanity of what we had, keeping it from being reduced to an object on display in someone else's narrative. The law proved less poetic. The petitions came with the merciless logic of forms, the kind that assumed there is a right place for everything and that the right place can be adjudicated by a signature. I sat through depositions with my wrists cooling on the table and Emily holding my hand under it, a small human proof against the clinical prose. Sometimes I felt as if I were reading my life aloud in a language that favored definitions over people. Other times, I sat outside and watched the barn door swing and thought of the nights we'd kept vigil and how thin some of those arguments sounded compared to the fact of breath. In the end, there was a compromise, not unlike those we make in families. An agreement was forged with a regional institution whose curators came to the house in sensible shoes and with notebooks. They wanted the artifacts, I wanted a guarantee, curatorial language that would place his life in context rather than spectacle. Emily insisted on a clause that allowed her a consultative role and that photographs be captioned with the dignity she thought they deserved. I demanded that certain objects remain here, where they belonged, because some things were not meant to be catalogued on someone else's shelf. It was tedious and necessary, and I felt, in the writing of those clauses, as if I were finally learning how to legislate mercy. The headlines kept their appetite. They wanted scandal and simplicity. They wrote about ownership as if a life could be parceled out and tagged. They wanted villains and saints in neat columns. There were letters, some tender, some furious, and one or two small gifts left on the stoop, a jar of preserves, a child's drawing of two figures under a tree. People did not all line up neatly into friends and enemies. They rearranged themselves in ways that made the ledger read like a map of a town rather than a directory of people. When the worst of the legal noise faded, we made choices that felt, in retrospect, like gestures of stewardship. We curated an archive that would travel, a selection of photographs, a few of his tools, the soft hat he preferred when the mornings insisted on cold. The rest remained in the barn under cedar and cloth, catalogued not as curiosities, but as evidence of a life lived in the peculiar space between shelter and secret. The museum agreed to a stipulation that their exhibit include testimony from neighbors and from us, who had been with him, testimony that would not exoticize but would narrate. There were consequences I did not predict. People began to come by appointment, quietly, some with tears in their eyes, some with the hard, skeptical faces of those who had come to learn rather than to feel. I showed them how he learned to make coffee, how he taught himself to tie his shoelaces with a patience most of us have forgotten. I would stand there, two hands curled around a cup, and tell them nothing more and nothing less than the truth as I had lived it. It was a small absolution, perhaps, to be listened to in that way. Nights still unspool their own ledger entries, the smell of apple and cinnamon when he baked, the crack in the radio's wooden casing that made certain stations swell into a plush hush, the way Emily would hum to him when she thought the barn had fallen asleep. I have learned that the act of telling is not merely an accounting of events. It is a way of keeping a life from collapsing into rumor. It is also, stubbornly, how we teach ourselves to keep going. Tomorrow I will rise and open another page. There are moments to tell of David's small betrayals of form, the time the tunnel needed a new route entirely, the way the town finally learned to say his name without a gasp. For now the porch is cool, the cedar box closes with a soft click, and the radio moves through the dusk, naming songs as if none of us had been changed. The ledger waits, and so do I. I will turn the page.